Life has a way of changing in an instant, one casual movement, one phone call, one turn of the wheel, and you're on the side of the road you'd so carefully planned to take together. One minute you're 32, happily married, with the man you love, the home you share, the little things you know, like your morning coffee and the jokes he tells you, laughing, even though you've heard them 1,000 times. The next, you're standing in a cold funeral home, choosing an urn for your ashes. Listening to a stone-faced man explain to you the difference between a standard cremation and a private one, because your husband's body was too damaged to be buried in an open casket. That's what happened to me. My name is Karen, and 6 months ago, my life was split in two. 6 months ago, James died in a car accident, and since that day, time has been a straight line. It became viscous, sticky, and I was stuck in my own grief like a fly in amber. It was neither sharp nor loud, it was heavy, sticky, penetrating every cell of my body. I tried to find some support in this new, frighteningly empty reality, where there were no more his steps in the hallway, his shoes by the door, his smell on the pillow, which I hid in the pillowcase because I was afraid of losing the last thing left of him. The first few weeks after the tragedy merged into a fog, through which I could barely distinguish faces, sounds, days of the week. Everything was like a bad dream, only I couldn't wake up. Funeral arrangements, dozens of calls, paperwork, tears of relatives, sleepless nights, all this followed in a sequence that I barely realized. If it weren't for my parents, who took on most of the troubles, I'm not sure I would have remained conscious. Karen, honey, we've made arrangements with the funeral home, my mother said one night, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, almost a whisper, almost a lullaby. Just focus on yourself, she added, and I just nodded, because it hurt to speak, like. The words were stuck in my chest and clawing at my heart. And before we continue, write in the comments what city you're watching this video from. Enjoy! The support group was my salvation. Every Tuesday night I'd go there, to a small room on the outskirts of town, where people with different faces but the same eyes that had seen loss, gathered in a circle and just were together. Some shared memories, some were silent. I was silent for a long time, just listening. But one particularly difficult night, I finally broke the silence. Some days are harder than others, I blurted out. My voice barely louder than my breath. Sometimes I wake up, and for a split second I forget he's gone. My confession hung in the air. And then Maria, a white-haired woman with kind lines around her eyes who had lost her husband 2 years ago, simply reached out and squeezed mine. It's okay, honey, grief comes in waves, and then it goes away, and then it comes back again, she said. And for the first time I felt like I wasn't alone. A few months passed, and I slowly began to clear away the piles of work that had previously seemed overwhelming. James had left me with a good financial reserve, our cozy house in the suburbs, a small but stylish apartment downtown, and a secure bank account. I could have quit my job at the marketing firm where I'd worked for 8 years, but the thought of sitting alone in an empty house all day made me not only afraid, but physically tremble. So I went part-time, just enough to keep my mind sane, to keep my mind occupied with tasks and not empty walls. But the most unexpected changes occurred in my relationship with my parents. All my childhood, I felt like I was standing in the shadow of my younger sister Sarah. Her dance performances, plays, diplomas, all this was accompanied by applause, flowers, and hugs, and my A's in math. A laconic good job at dinner and nothing more. I was used to being second, the spare, invisible. But after James died, something changed. One evening, Dad called and, slightly embarrassed, asked, Karen, honey, we were wondering, could you help us out a little financially? At least $1,500 a month? I didn't even hesitate. Of course, I answered. Because in this, oddly enough, I found meaning, to take care of them, to be needed. From then on, weekly dinners at my parents' house became something of an anchor for me. Mom would cook her famous pot roast, the same recipe passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. Dad would pour wine, and we would talk about nothing and everything at once. In these conversations, for the first time, I felt like my parents saw me, not as someone's sister, not as a widow, but as a grown woman, interesting, strong, capable. Karen, tell us more about this new project you're working on. Dad would ask with genuine interest, raising his eyebrows. Seriously, that sounds impressive. A marketing campaign, huh? What if it actually brings in new clients? I shared my thoughts, and for the first time in a long time, there was no sympathy in their eyes, only respect. But everything changed that night when Sarah came to dinner. She walked in, beaming as always, holding her rounded belly in her hand, 7 months pregnant. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, and her appearance was like a flash, bright, booming, blinding. My mother immediately jumped up. "Sarah, dear, sit here." I felt her hand gently but firmly push me aside. "Do you need a pillow? Are your feet swollen? There you go, my dear." And again I became invisible. Click, and everything was as before. The whole room turned to her. All attention again belonged to someone else. The familiar ache of being overlooked again slowly but surely settled in my chest, like an old friend I foolishly thought I had left behind, in those distant teenage years when I was still trying to win my parents' attention, clutching in my hands honors diplomas that no one but me was interested in. And there it was, that painful, searing prick, back at that dinner table, with my mother's stew being served and my father's patient, beaming gaze directed solely at Sarah. I tried to join in the conversation, smiling tightly, and asked, trying to sound neutral, over dinner, "So who's the father?" There was a tense, teeth-gritting silence for a second. "Have you told him about the baby?" I added softly but directly, no longer able to pretend that her pregnancy was not a subject I wasn't supposed to talk about. Sarah's face darkened at that moment, as if I had intruded on territory I didn't belong on. "That's my business," she snapped, not looking up and moving the green peas from one side of her plate to the other, as if trying to shield herself from the question with vegetables. "I don't have to share every detail of my personal life," she added sharply, and there was that same defensive edge to her voice that I'd heard her use in my youth, when she'd gotten caught and pretended the world owed her something. My mother, of course, had jumped to her defense, as if on cue. "Karen, mind your own business. Your sister doesn't need to explain herself to anyone." Her voice was icy, and there was no hint of the gentleness with which she'd spoken to me after James's death. And then, barely suppressing a shudder, I realized how different their reactions were now from when I was going through painful and humiliating fertility treatments. Back then, they had no doubt that they had every right to demand reports on every step, ask questions, give advice. Someone recommended herbs, someone else recommended a change of doctor, someone else simply recommended relaxing. I remembered how my mother would call me after each visit to the specialist, asking, "So, what happened? What did he say?" Dad once even suggested that I go to Mexico for alternative therapy, which, according to him, definitely helped his colleague's daughter. But now Sarah doesn't have to explain anything to anyone. She's protected, like a jewel under glass. "But how are you going to cope alone?" I pressed, trying to sound calm but firm. During yet another dinner, watching her pick at a piece of secondo, yes, that's what she called beef, on her plate. "Children are expensive," I added, more as a fact than an accusation. Sarah waved a dismissive hand without blinking. "Don't worry about my baby," she said, with the same smirk I'd known since childhood, the one she wore when she was lying or evading, or simply knew that everything would work out in her favor again. "We won't need anything from anyone," she added, her fingers stroking her belly with such confidence that it seemed she wasn't carrying a baby, but a golden ticket to a carefree life. I knew it all in that moment. I should have noticed that smile before, but I'd seen it so many times that it had almost lost its meaning. Like the background you get used to and stop noticing, Sarah had always been a master of the quick fix, an organic smoothie business that had gone bust after 2 weeks because, it turned out, her partner didn't have FDA approval, the life coaching certification she'd started but never finished because it was boring and uninspiring, the cryptocurrency investment that had cost her 3 months' rent and blamed it on an unfair market, and now, sitting at the table, she was slapping her stomach, as if trying to convince us, and herself, that this time everything would work out as planned. "Trust me," she said, her eyes twinkling and a note in her voice that would have been alarming if it hadn't been so familiar. Dad, of course, was beaming. He looked at her as if she'd just announced a cure for cancer. "That's my girl," he said proudly, and there was no doubt in his tone. "Always lands on her feet." I took another bite of the stew, chewing slowly, with difficulty, because there was that familiar lump in my throat and the same old yearning inside me, to be second to her. Second to her mistakes, her whims, her promises, her failures. Some things, no matter how hard you try, never change. I thought about that as I watched my parents hang on Sarah's every word, as if she were preaching from the pulpit of truth. Sarah's call came on Tuesday morning. I was at my desk, reviewing my marketing reports, when her name lit up my phone. I almost let it go to voicemail. Our conversations were always short, choppy, awkward, but something stopped me this time. Karen, her voice was sweet, too sweet, with that cloying caress she reserved for times when she needed something. I'm having a baby shower at Mom and Dad's next weekend. I'd love it if you could come. She continued, her voice snaking around me like ivy. Soft and sticky and lingering. I froze. The invitation had caught me off guard. Our last real conversation had been at James's funeral. Even then, she'd been distracted, like she didn't know what to make of my pain. Are you sure? I asked, unable to hide my surprise. I could count on one hand the number of times Sarah had willingly included me in something. Of course, she laughed. The sound was odd, almost mechanical. You're my only sister. It wouldn't be right without you. Plus, I have something planned, special. Something in her tone made me flinch, my insides clenching, but I pushed the feeling away. I'll be there, I promised, already running gift ideas through my head, as if this were my way of protecting myself. Maybe this was her attempt to close the gap between us. Maybe. The following Saturday, I arrived at my parents' house, carrying 2 carefully wrapped packages, an expensive baby monitor with a camera, and a handmade blanket, lovingly crocheted. After all, it was my sister's future child, my niece or nephew. The place looked like a pastel hurricane had blown through it. Pink and blue balloons were everywhere, streamers cascaded from the ceiling, wrapping around every lamp and shelf, and a giant diaper cake sat in the center of the room. I knew Sarah would try to make this the event of the year. She was putting on a show, as always, and seemed to have invited half the town. Aunt Margaret was there, in her trademark brooches and curious eyes, with her 2 grown daughters, whose obsession with family gossip had only increased with age. Mom's bridge friends had taken over the sofa, scattered like pearls on a velvet cushion, eagerly catching the rumors that floated quietly in the air. Sarah's former college roommates were huddled around the punch, giggling over memories, their voices merging into a syrupy wave of mirth. The whole atmosphere was like a scene from a badly acted play, where the actors were overacting and the audience knew that something else was going on behind the scenes. Sarah made her entrance, as always, wading through the crowd in a flowing buttercream dress whose material, I was sure, cost more than my monthly rent. She was glowing with the neon light of confidence and courage, but there was something predatory behind that smile, as if she wasn't just hosting guests but hunting, and that predatory quality, wrapped in a smile and thick curls, made me feel uneasy. Her eyes, as if glued to mine, found me again and again in the crowd, holding my gaze a split second longer than was appropriate, as if there was something more hidden in that silence between our eye meetings, something unsaid, something left unsaid, and I was beginning to drown in that silent dialogue. We played all the traditional games that Mom and her friends thought made a baby shower fun, measuring Sarah's belly with a string, guessing the baby's due date, even playing that dreaded game of melted chocolate and diapers. Yes, it was the absurdity of American baby showers, and I tried not to show my inner awkwardness. I won the belly measuring contest, and though my victory was accidental, Sarah took it as a challenge. Her face twitched for a second, as if I'd stepped on a blister she'd been keeping an eye on. All the while, she kept giving me these strange, expectant looks, as if she were waiting not for a moment of joy but for an explosion, and the longer I tried to remain calm, the more taut the tension became, stretching the room like a taut string. After the gifts had been opened and the applause had died down a bit, Sarah came over to me. She picked up the blanket I had knitted for her unborn child, every stitch of it a part of my quiet reconciliation, my desire to be there despite everything. Ran her fingers over the pattern and, turning abruptly, clinked a spoon against her glass. The whole room instantly went silent. My heart suddenly started beating faster. For no apparent reason, just like that, as if my body knew it was about to hear something that would change everything. The air suddenly became thick, viscous, as if someone had poured thick syrup into it, and I found it hard to breathe. I want to thank everyone for coming today, Sarah began, placing a hand on her stomach and smiling, like an actress finally taking center stage. But there's one more thing I need to share. Her voice was quieter, almost intimate, and for that moment no one in the room moved. I think it's time for everyone to know who the father of my child is. My heart was pounding like a hammer on an anvil. The roar in my ears was unbearable, and even before she continued, I knew what she was going to say, and I still wasn't ready. Sarah's eyes were glued to mine, and I knew, Yes, she wanted me to hear it first, to remember this moment in detail, in every shade of pain. The father, she said slowly, her voice echoing around the silent room, is James Wilson, Karen's late husband. The world tilted, I felt everything in me, blood, memory, the last of my dignity, suddenly shift as if my entire internal landscape had been shaken. Through the roar in my ears, I heard sighs, like a wind blowing through the room. Someone whispered. Aunt Margaret's hand flew to her mouth as if in prayer. Sarah's friends huddled closer, as if trying to hide behind each other. But what struck me most was something else. My parents' faces. There was no shock in them, not a drop, not a shadow, only a tired calm, like people who have known the truth for a long time and were just waiting for the right moment. They knew from the very beginning. I wanted to scream, I wanted to explode, but before I had time, Sarah was already talking again, her voice strained to the limit of self-satisfaction. She turned straight to me, slowly, with pleasure, like a cat playing with a captured mouse. Since James's child is his only heir, she said with exaggerated clarity, I am entitled to half of everything he left you, the house, the apartment, the money. My child deserves his father's inheritance. The room spun, and I had to grab the back of the nearest chair to keep from falling. But that wasn't the end of it. My parents stood as if on cue, one on either side of Sarah. Like bodyguards, like prosecution lawyers. Karen, my dad began in his businesslike, distant voice, you need to do the right thing. Your nephew deserves his father's inheritance. I found my voice, but it came out hoarse, almost a whisper. You're lying. All of you are lying, James would never. But before I could finish, Sarah pulled out her phone, her face breaking into a hard, triumphant smile. How do you explain that? She asked, turning the screen toward me. And then my world came crashing down again. The photo was of James and Sarah. He held her and kissed her in what looked like a hotel room, the furniture unfamiliar, the light dim from a bedside lamp. In another picture, they were holding hands in a restaurant, laughing. I didn't recognize the gestures. I didn't recognize him. He loved me, Sarah said, her voice penetrating every crevice of my mind. He was going to leave you for me. We were going to tell you everything. And then she wheezed, as if the air in her throat had run out. Tears began to stream down her face, heavy, full, as if they were leaking from some long broken vessel inside her. And for a moment her bitterness seemed real, almost touching. Until the words began to ring in my ears again, until the hum that had torn through my mind like an electric wave returned. Then the accident happened, and all our plans, she whispered, and I couldn't stay in this room, in this house, in this body that seemed to no longer belong to me. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think, my body moved on its own, on some primal instinct, as if it understood that I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my purse, I don't remember if I zipped it up, and pushing through the rows of whispering guests, some of whom lowered their eyes, others watched me with the morbid interest with which people watch a fire. I stumbled, bumped into chairs, until I finally got outside and ran to the car. Mom was calling me, her voice sounded insistent, even anxious, but I had already put the car in reverse, and her words dissolved in the roar of the engine. The drive home was a blur, as if all the colors had faded and the headlights were blurring in the water droplets before my eyes. The photos kept playing in my head like a broken record. James and Sarah, smiling, close, in love. I tried to make sense of them, to fit them into my old picture of the world, but the pieces wouldn't fit. The photos in the restaurant were probably taken during those very business dinners he told me about. He claimed that he sometimes stayed at a hotel so as not to waste time on the road. I believed him, I wanted to believe him. As soon as I crossed the threshold of the house, my phone vibrated, as if it knew I wouldn't be given a break. Messages from Sarah poured in one after another, short, catchy, like bait on a hook. There were screenshots of their correspondence, lines that pierced the heart with the precision of a surgeon. I don't love her anymore. We haven't seen each other for a long time. We'll tell everyone after the divorce. You're the only one I want to be with. I can't wait to start our life together. Each new message appeared like a new blow, like another cut on the inner surface of my soul. The timestamps were the worst. They showed that their correspondence had begun long before I started my fertility treatments, when I still believed that I was the problem, that James wanted a child from me, and not just a child. They were building their future while I lived in an illusion, in hope, in pain. That night I spent in a house that suddenly felt alien, as if the walls knew and were silent. I walked from room to room, touching James's things, his tie, his book with the bookmark, his cup with the crack at the handle, and asked myself, was anything real? Or is everything a lie, from beginning to end? The first call from my parents came at 7 a.m. sharp. I watched the screen flash, but I let it ring 4 times before I answered, already anticipating what I would hear. Karen, you need to be reasonable, my father began, with the cold precision with which he conducted his legal affairs, without even bothering to greet me. The sooner you agree to split the inheritance, the easier it will be for everyone. His voice was laced with casual arrogance, and it boiled inside me like water in a saucepan brought to the boiling point. Easier, for whom? I hissed, but before he could respond, my mother intervened. For Sarah, for you, for all of us, honey, she said, and I realized that I was standing in front of a wall of no remorse. I was on speakerphone. They spoke as if they were talking about business, not my life, not my pain. I summoned all my strength to ask one question, and the word came out almost in a whisper. When? When did you find out about them? There was a pause, that uncertainty that always says more than any confession. Finally, my mother said, We've known each other for a while. I felt the ground beneath my feet shift again. James confided in us about 6 months before the accident, she admitted, and every syllable of the words sounded like a slap in the face. 6 months. 6 months they knew, 6 months they hid, 6 months they watched me cry on their shoulders at the funeral, accepted my monthly transfers, thanked me, hugged me, silently collecting the money, all the while knowing that my husband and my sister were planning a new life. Traitors, I hissed, and the words seemed cold as ice. All of you. And without waiting for any arguments or excuses, I hung up and immediately blocked their numbers. My hand shook as I opened the banking app, but it didn't flinch as I, without a moment's hesitation, canceled the monthly transfer. Let them ask their precious Sarah now, let her support them now. 2 weeks passed in a thick fog. I ignored the calls, deleted the messages without reading them, as if each of them were poison, and then an email arrived, from Sarah, politely, legally correct, and detached. She informed me that she would sue me unless I voluntarily agreed to give up half of everything. The word voluntarily had never sounded like a curse to me before, but this time it hit me like a whip. I couldn't bear the thought of answering. I couldn't even imagine what I would say. I couldn't breathe from the memories, from James's betrayal, from their texts, from the look in her eyes the second she said his name. I thought about all the people who must have known, who might have seen them together, who might have even nodded sympathetically when I told them about James leaving on a business trip while he ate dinner with her. The whispers at work had become unbearable. People were talking under their breath, but loud enough for me to hear. Some of my colleagues were looking at me with sympathy, but there was a hidden mockery in that sympathy. Tom, my boss, one of the few who hadn't turned away, who had stayed by my side, called me into his office after I broke down in the middle of a client meeting. He said softly, take some time off, paid or unpaid, whatever works for you. Your job will be here when you're ready to come back. His voice was quiet, but there was no pity in it, only sympathy, real, adult, so rare in a world where you are expected to pull yourself together, smile and move on, even if there is an abyss yawning beneath you. I nodded gratefully, not trusting his voice. And that same day I gathered the things on my desk, carefully folding the frame with our photograph, the notebook with notes and the cup with fingerprints that, as it seemed to me then, still remembered James's warmth. The next few weeks merged into a viscous, opaque space in which the days flowed one after another without events, without sounds, without light. I became a hermit in my own home, voluntarily imprisoning myself in the walls that had once been a fortress of love and now had become a tomb of memories. I ordered grocery delivery, choosing the contactless option. Ignored the doorbell when it rang, even if my heart skipped a beat at the unexpected sound. I spent hours looking through old photographs, trying to find signs, hints, any clue I might have missed. Every happy memory now seemed false to me, a scene from a play in which I was the only spectator, unaware that it was all an illusion. Every moment of our marriage, every vacation, every smile, every mealtime we cooked together, every argument over what movie to watch, even his morning kisses, all of it was overshadowed by the realization that he was living a double life, and not just with anyone, but with my own sister. The news came like a punch to the gut. Via Facebook, Sarah had given birth to a baby boy. In the photo, she was lying in a hospital bed, beaming like she was the leading lady. Our parents were leaning over her, their eyes shining with pride, their hands gently supporting the newborn, wrapped in a cream blanket, the same one I'd knitted for the shower, weaving my pain, my forgiveness, my regret into it. It was a deliberate jab, as if she knew this was the blanket she'd show the world. I closed the app before I could read the comments, but not before I saw the caption underneath the photo. She'd named him James. James. A week passed before a thick manila envelope appeared in my mailbox. I already knew what I would find inside: a subpoena. Sarah had formally filed her claim. She was suing for half of everything James had left me, claiming her son's right to his father's inheritance. The legalese was cold, sterile, like an operating room: no emotion, no regrets, just demands: the house, half the money, partial ownership of a condo downtown, everything. I spent 3 days researching lawyers, running through names, reading reviews, consulting the few who were still on my side, before settling on Richard Martinez, a lawyer with a reputation for being tough but fair in probate matters. He was already shuffling papers when I walked into his office, his expression deliberately neutral, as if he were preparing for a difficult conversation. "Ms. Wilson," he began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "I have to be honest with you, your sister has compelling evidence of a long-term relationship with your late husband, text messages, photographs, witness statements, including from your own parents." He paused, giving me time to digest each word. In probate cases like this, proof of an intimate relationship coupled with the presence of a biological child. Well, the courts are generally sympathetic. I sat there, stunned, still processing the news, when my phone rang that evening. An unknown number. I almost didn't pick it up, but an impulse that wasn't fear so much as a vague premonition made me press the green button. "Hello, is this Karen Wilson?" A female voice, unfamiliar but somehow resonating in the deepest recesses of my memory, a chord of recognition. Something in her tone, the rhythm of her speech, the warmth that suddenly made my heart skip a beat. "I'm Elizabeth Parker, James's mother." The world tilted. I clutched the kitchen table to steady myself. "That's impossible," I whispered, because James had always told me he was an orphan, that his parents had died when he was little, that he had grown up in foster care, with no roots, no history. "Another lie." "I'm afraid," she said, and there was no malice in her voice, only pain. "I'm afraid you've fallen prey to many of his secrets, but would you mind meeting me? There are things you need to know, things that might help you." We agreed to meet at a small cafe in the center of town the next morning. Neutral territory. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, even the coffee I'd ordered untouched. I nearly dropped my cup when she walked in. The resemblance was uncanny. James had her eyes, her smile, even the way she carried herself, her posture, fluid, graceful, all the things I loved about him. She sat down opposite me, and for a few moments we simply looked at each other. "I was at a funeral," she said quietly, as we settled into a corner, away from prying ears, sat in the back row, in a black dress and a veil. I couldn't bring myself to approach you then, James, and I hadn't spoken for years." Elizabeth continued after a long pause, looking me straight in the eye with that quiet, hard-won pain that couldn't be mistaken for the theater. Suddenly, as if by a click, a vague memory appeared in my mind, a solitary female figure, almost gliding past on her way out before the service ended, a black dress, a thick veil, the clear outline of her face hidden by the net, and at the time I had been too lost in my grief to wonder who she was. Why she was alone, why she was keeping to herself. But now that everything had fallen into place, the memory crystallized with frightening clarity: an elegant woman in black, standing apart from everyone else, with that special expression that comes from those who know too much and cannot change anything. "Why are you speaking now?" I asked, trying to hide the suspicion creeping into my voice. After everything I'd learned about James, after every open letter, every betrayal, every layer of lies, I found it hard to trust anything or anyone, especially when it came to his past. Elizabeth didn't take offense. She slowly pulled a manila envelope from her purse, worn at the edges, creased from being taken out and put back, carried around, hesitant to give it away. "Because I've heard what your sister says," she said quietly, her fingers shaking as she slid the envelope across the table, "and because, no matter what, I can't let another woman suffer because of my son's lies." I tore open the seal, feeling as if I were opening not an envelope, but a piece of my own reality. Inside were medical records from Boston City Hospital, dating back 10 years, to the year before James and I married. I skimmed the papers, my heart sinking. the blood draining from my face, total azoospermia, permanently sterile, natural conception impossible. Each clinical word pounded my brain like stones in the surf. Elizabeth looked away, he was depressed. It was one of the last things we discussed before our fight. He could never get over it. I couldn't speak, not a sound. All those years of fertility treatments, endless doctor visits, hormone injections, internalized blame, tears into my pillow, and silent envy of pregnant women, it had all been a cruel charade in which I had played by someone else's rules, unaware that the scene was false from the start. The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. I sat with Richard, off to the side, and Sarah sat in the front row, looking the perfect grieving, almost widowed presence, in her knee-length black dress, barely their makeup, her hair neatly pulled back. She was the epitome of public grief. Baby James Jr. slept peacefully in her arms, and our parents sat next to her, cuddling her as if it were their mission to preserve not the truth but a myth. As Sarah began to testify, her voice shook but her conviction remained. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of her great love for James, of how they had dreamed of a family, of how tragedy had shattered their future. "All I want," she whispered, her voice breaking, "is justice for my son. He deserves his father's legacy." My attorney, Mr. Martinez, did not interrupt. He let her finish, and then stood, calm and firm. "Your Honor," he began, "I would like to present evidence that proves Ms. Thompson's claim is fraudulent." He walked up to the judge's desk and handed over the medical records. The judge looked at them, her face unreadable. The seconds ticked by. Sarah's lawyer jumped up, arguing for authenticity, arguing forgery, citing a dubious chain of custody. For the first time, Sarah's composure cracked. "These documents are forged," she cried, clutching the baby tighter. "She forged them to steal my child's inheritance." "Your Honor," Martinez continued calmly, "given that these records show Mr. Wilson was sterile, we request a DNA test to establish paternity." I didn't know what to expect, but what happened next was the first real light in a long line of darkness. "That's impossible," Sarah blurted out, still clinging to her story. "James was an orphan, his body was cremated, who are you going to test on?" "Actually, Mr. Martinez said, turning to the gallery, "we have the opportunity to test in a direct line of descent. I would like to introduce Elizabeth Parker, the biological mother of James Wilson." Elizabeth stood up, and the room filled with whispers. Even from where I sat, I could see Sarah's face go pale. She turned toward her slowly, as if her body was not obeying. "I am willing to take a DNA test," Elizabeth announced clearly, "to determine whether this child is my grandson." The judge nodded. "The DNA test is scheduled. We will reconvene when the results are ready." Sarah swayed slightly in her seat, all the color draining from her face. Our mother rushed to her side, supported her by the shoulders, and, throwing me a venomous look, whispered something I could not understand. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope. The courtroom fell silent as the judge opened the envelope containing the DNA test results. Sarah sat rigid as a string, the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, unaware of the drama that was playing out around its tiny body. "The results conclusively show," the judge's voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt, "that there is no genetic connection between the minor child and Mrs. Elizabeth Parker. Therefore, it can be concluded that James Wilson was not the father of this child." There was a collective, uncontrollable, instinctive sigh in the courtroom, and for a brief moment I felt the tension that had kept me on edge begin to ease. Sarah's face wrinkled as if she had swallowed something bitter, and she began to sob. Her mascara running down her cheeks, leaving inky streaks on her skin, runs of the mask she had worn so diligently. "Miss Thompson," the judge's tone was stern, her voice steely and merciless, like a sentence, "could you explain why you committed this fraud in court?" Sarah clutched the baby tighter to her, his tiny head resting peacefully on her shoulder, unaware of the turmoil raging around her. "At the time James died and was cremated," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I was seeing several men. I thought no one would ever know that he had money. I needed," she faltered. "So you tried to deceive your own sister." The judge's voice was both a rebuke and a verdict, "and used your parents as unwitting accomplices in the scheme." Sarah began to whimper, but her speech was losing its force. Even our parents looked stunned, as if their eyes had finally been opened to see not the picture of a caring daughter, but the figure of lies they had helped to maintain. The judge didn't delay, her decision came like a bolt from the blue. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Karen Wilson. All claims by Sarah Thompson to the Wilson estate are dismissed with prejudice. Ms. Thompson, you are fortunate that Mrs. Wilson has not filed criminal charges for attempted fraud. As we left the courthouse, my parents came up to me. My mother was crying, her face tired, blurry, like an old photograph that had been handled too often. My father looked older than I had ever seen him. Karen, honey, my mother extended her hand, but I did not move to meet it. We had no idea Sarah was lying. We can fix this. We've been fighting since you stopped the wires. I raised my hand, firmly, without anger, but finally, just don't. I took out my phone and, looking them in the eye, blocked their numbers right there at the courthouse doors, and then turned and walked away without looking back, not giving them a chance, not a second chance. Elizabeth was waiting for me by the car, standing a little further away, as reserved as ever. Are you okay? She asked quietly. I hadn't expected to laugh, and yet, hearing my own laugh, I realized it was real, the first I'd heard in a long time. Do you know who I feel like? I said, looking up at the sky, where the clouds were slowly drifting over the city. Not who I was, and not who they thought I was, but who I was perhaps destined to be. I took a deep breath, the first time I felt anything but the weight on my chest. I thought about the apartment downtown James had left me, the glass walls, the concrete floors, the way it had always felt cold and foreign. I never liked it, I told Elizabeth, too many memories, but maybe you'll like it. Her eyes widened. Karen, no, I can't, please. I insist, I interrupted. You gave me my life back when you gave me those tapes, let me give you something in return. A week later, I handed her the keys. She hugged me, and her voice, that tremulous whisper, said it all. I never thought I'd have a daughter. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the family had been trying to contact me, through distant relatives, through mutual friends, through overt attempts to apologize, but I cut those ties, like old knots tied in pity. Sarah sent a letter saying she had changed, that she was sorry, that she needed help with the baby. I didn't open it, I just threw it away. Every week, Elizabeth and I have dinner together. We sit around the table, 2 generations of women bound not by blood but by truth, by trust, by pain and the fact that we managed to get through it. We share stories about James, the good and the bad, the unvarnished. She helps me understand that even though he was not the man I thought he was, that doesn't invalidate our happy moments. They were real, they were mine. I recently packed up the rest of James's things. Elizabeth helped. We gave some to charity. I put the rest in boxes and put them in the attic, not because I want to forget them, but because they no longer rule my life. While we worked, she told me stories about James when he was a little boy, before the lying began. Somehow, it made me feel better to know that this James really existed. I'm not ready to date yet, and I may not be for a while, but I've started living my life again. I've gone back to work full-time, joined a travel club, and am already planning my first solo vacation, without anyone else, without having to explain or give in, just me and the road. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I barely recognize the woman looking back at me. She's stronger, quieter, more honest. Life, it turns out, has a way of throwing surprises. I lost the family I was born into, but I found a new one. I never thought my path would lead me to a place where I'd be alone, but not lonely. This isn't the life I planned, but maybe this is the life I was meant to live all along.